Okay, let's get to the heart of the matter here. Okay, general anti-Israel points. These are 5 points that you're gonna hear. Now, I have to be honest with you. I mean, we could do this for a month straight, right? We could be talking about general anti-Israel points and going through the different sides of each point and the nuance and the complexity, and we could do 40 of 50 of these points that are always brought up against Israel. I chose 5 that I think, number one, we hear more often, and number two, I think that our teens are hearing and might themselves feel. Okay, the first one is that, and by the way, okay, yeah, the first one is Jewish people have no rights to the land. Okay, and that includes Judea and Samaria, where, by the way, all honesty here, that's where I live. I live in Judea and Samaria, Yehuda v'Shomron, what the world calls the West Bank. Okay, and what the Palestinian side says is that they've been living in this land for a couple hundred years, 1,000 years. Some of them say 4,000 years. Some of my neighbors in Yericho say they've been there for 12,000 years. Okay, and they say that the Jewish people have ancient or no claims to this land. And the way that the world gave us this land in the UN vote in 1947 was based on just misplaced mercy for their guilt over allowing the Holocaust to happen. And they took the land from the Palestinians, even though the Palestinians had nothing to do with the Holocaust, which isn't so true. But right, that's that, and so therefore Israel has no right to the land of Palestine. And in 1967, when Israel conquered the West Bank, the Golan Heights, the Sinai Desert, and the Gaza Strip, so that was a breaking international law, and it makes Israel today an occupying power. That's the accusation against Israel. Okay, so the truth is, and here's our response, is that according to all metrics that the United Nations uses, Israel is Jews. Excuse me, I shouldn't say Israel. Jews are the indigenous people of this land. Okay, that's that. And now again, I have for a lot of these things, if you need the backups to it, although if you get too much in the weeds, you're going to lose your teens. You've already lost them at that point. But I have articles that show all of this. Okay. So the idea is that we are the indigenous people of the land. The international community in 1947 recognized that we have this ancient connection to this land and restored this land to the Jewish people. Okay. Now, Palestinians have been on this land for a couple hundred years. The most that any Palestinian and any Arab has been on this land is 1,000 years. Arabs come from Arabia. Jews come from Judea. There's a reason why we're called what we're called. Okay. Judea and Samaria in specific has always been Jewish land. It's always been historic land. If you go through Tanakh, most of the cities that you're going to find in Tanakh are in Yehuda v'Shomron. They're not Netanya, Haifa, Tel Aviv, right? These are all relatively new cities, okay? Israel reconquered its own historic land in 1967 from Jordan, okay? And at no point in world history was Judea and Samaria, or even greater Israel, anywhere from the river to the sea, a part of an independent Palestinian state. That never happened. So when the accusation is that we've taken this land from Palestinians, that's just false. This is our land and recognized by the international community. We're not just quoting the first Rashi in the Torah. This is something that the international community has agreed to. Okay, not so much Judea and Samaria, although America did, but Israel itself for sure. Okay. The second point that you're going to hear is that Israel oppresses Palestinians and Israel is an apartheid state. Okay, so the accusation is that against Israel is that it discriminates against Palestinians living in Gaza and what the world calls the West Bank. It gives Jews civil and human rights that it denies to the Palestinians. Israel is guilty of ethnic cleansing against Palestinians, and it's trying to cleanse Israel, this Jewish phony state, of all Palestinians. Okay, that's the accusation against Israel. Our teens aren't going to really get into the genocidal type of accusations. They're going to know that that's not true, but definitely apartheid, definitely oppression, definitely denying human and civil rights to Palestinians. Okay, and maybe ethnic cleansing. Okay, that could be something that you hear. Okay, those are the accusations. What's our response? Okay. So our response is that Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are not under Israeli control. Yes, Israel controls the security of that entire area insofar as it'll affect Israel. But in terms of Palestinian day-to-day life, that's under control in the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority, and in Gaza under Hamas. Okay, these are the two entities that deny Palestinians human and civil rights. And I'm going to make this point so clear because this is such an important point. Any human or civil right that Israel is accused of denying to Palestinians is either one of two things. It's either being denied to them by Palestinian Authority or Hamas, or it's not an actual human right. Okay, I'll give you an example. The right to vote. Palestinians haven't had elections in 16 years. Palestinians are allowed to vote. Their leaders are not holding elections. Supposed to be one this year, not going to happen. It was suspended. Okay. An example of a false human right. Okay. And by the way, the United Nations has a list of human rights. These aren't something that are just up in the air. An example of a human right that Palestinians accuse Israel of denying them is freedom of movement. Palestinians can't go to Yerushalayim whenever they want to. A Palestinian that's my neighbor here in Yericho cannot go to Yerushalayim whenever they want. They need to apply to Israel for a permit. That denies them the human right of freedom of movement. That's true. We are denying them freedom of movement, but there is no human right of freedom of movement. A Canadian cannot just go to America. Mexican can't go to America. Someone from Guatemala can't just go to America. There is no such thing as a human right of freedom of movement. We have something called borders. A lot of progressives feel there shouldn't be borders. That's fine. You can think that way, but that's just not the way life is right now. In which case, there is no human right of freedom of movement.
We have a question.
You want to take questions in the middle? Sure. Okay, Zionism is a racist movement designed to deny Palestinians their land. Okay, that's what Zionism is. The accusation against Israel is that Zionism is a movement that wanted to exclude all non-Jews, and specifically Arabs, from the land of Palestine, right? It's a racist movement because it favors one religion, Judaism, over others, okay? And that's why Zionism is a racist movement, and the UN was right when it declared Zionism racism, and it should not have taken it off. Okay. The answer to this is that the Jewish people were homeless for 2,000 years and constantly at the whim of foreign nations who were not always hospitable to us. Okay. The Jewish people have a right, like all other people, including Palestinians, to self-determination on their own homeland, their historic homeland. Okay. Zionism doesn't say that only Jews should live in Israel. There's no part of Zionism that says that. Okay, it doesn't exclude other people from living in Israel. It welcomes Jewish people and encourages Jewish people to move back to their homeland. Over 20% of Israel's population are non-Jewish, and over 2 million Arabs enjoy the exact same civil rights as all other Israeli citizens, Jewish, non-Jewish, it doesn't make a difference. Okay? That is why Zionism is not a racist movement. Okay. The next point, Israel advocates just cry anti-Semitism whenever there is legitimate criticism of Israel. Okay, so in order to avoid, the accusation goes that in order to avoid legitimate criticism of things that Israel does wrong, so all advocates of Israel do is just say, oh, the reason why you're saying that is because you're anti-Semitic. Even if you're Jewish, you're just parroting anti-Semitic points. And you don't even realize you're a self-hating Jew. That's what they tell us. And even anti-Zionism is really anti-Semitism, right? That's what they say. But that's not true. Not all criticism of Israel, and not even anti-Zionism, is anti-Semitism. That's the accusation made against Israel. Okay, and the answer is you're right, 100%. Criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism is not necessarily anti-Semitism, but much of what you hear today and much of the anti-Israel rhetoric that you hear is based in anti-Semitism and might very well be anti-Semitic. Okay, if people hold Israel to a double standard, okay, where it demands better behavior from Israel than it does other nations of the world, okay, or it uses a slander or lies against Israel, okay, so or the criticism is unfair, okay, or unfounded. So then at that point, that is where criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. There's no other explanation for it. Okay, so it's very true. We accept criticism. Israelis are the biggest critics of Israel, right? That's I saw a great line today from the Israeli John Oliver. Gave in English, he answered John Oliver's television show, and he said, "I make my living criticizing Israel." Right? There's nothing wrong with criticizing Israel. The question is, where does your criticism come from? So it's not that Israelis, or at least Israelis and their advocates, shouldn't be. It's not that they are crying anti-Semitism in order to get out of legitimate criticism of Israel. There's just a lot of times where the criticism of Israel is either unfounded or it's holding Israel to a double standard that no one else is held to, in which case then you have to say, why is the Jewish state the only state being questioned here? Okay. Israel is a country uninterested in peace. Okay, so the accusation against Israel is that Israel is uninterested in making peace with its enemies and Palestinians in the West Bank. Right? Israel's constant settlement building, its occupation of the West Bank, the blockade of Gaza, all show that Israel has zero interest whatsoever in making peace with Israel. And the pro-Israel response to it is that going back to Israel's Declaration of Independence, it's literally in our Declaration of Independence that Israel has reached out its hand in peace to its Arab neighbors. Okay, we've given up land to Egypt and Jordan in our peace deals with them. We signed the Abraham Accords with 4 different Arab countries. Okay, we've attempted to make peace with the Palestinians more than 5 different times, and for 73 years have held our hand out to Palestinians and asked them for peace. The most inaccurate description of Israel would be that it is uninterested in peace. We have tried time and time again to make peace with the Palestinians, with the Arabs, and they are not interested. Hamas as an organization refuses to negotiate with peace and calls for our annihilation and destruction, in which case the only peace we could have with them is if we agree to march into the sea. So that is a completely false accusation.